Yes, hello once again, and another warm welcome back to your number one and favourite old school vintage dirt bike channel, CDB TV. And again, thanks to all the brand new subscribers who have just recently signed up to my channel. We're now well on our way to that elusive 17,000 subscribers total. So again, thanks to each and every one of you who have subscribed in the last few weeks, and I hope you continue to find more of those old school dirt bikes to your pleasing here on my channel. But right now we're going to take a look at a bike that I came across at the 2022 Northern Ireland Classic Scramble in August of that year, and this very nice bike belongs to Irishman Paul Morrow. So let's jump straight into that video and take a look at Paul's lovely 1984 RM250E Suzuki. Okay, so this lovely Evolution RM250 Suzuki is just one of the many bikes that I came across during my paddock walkabout while I was at the Northern Ireland's annual charity scramble event that was held at Craig Antlet in 2022. Now, this bike belongs to Irish rider Paul Morrow, and this particular Suzuki is a 1984 RM250E model, and Paul was racing this bike over the course of the 2 days of the charity event, and I just happened to grab these few clips and just a couple of pictures of his bike before the first race of the day. But for 1984, these RM250s were certainly very good bikes for their time, because they had an excellent chassis, they handled well, and they were also complemented by a very buzzy 250 two-stroke water-cooled engine that was both quick and generally reliable. But firstly, the 84 RMs did have this quite light gauge tubular steel chassis that was painted blue, of course, to make them look like the works factory bikes of their day. And even although the frame was made of steel, it was still a relatively light chassis at just 225 pounds, which made it very flickable and easy enough to chuck around the racetrack. But again, as you'd expect, because this was made with steel, it was naturally tough and strong, and frame breakages were not that common on these 84 chassis. And so moving on to our RM's 250 power plant, which was a single cylinder two-stroke reed valve induction liquid cooled engine that was said to punch out around the 34 horsepower mark, and in terms of its power output, these were without doubt very buzzy little two-stroke engines that didn't have much to offer at the bottom end, but certainly they did their very best work in the mid-range, where all of its hard-working ponies could certainly be found. But these 84 250s were, of course, the non-power valve models, which made it basically just a run-of-the-mill two-stroker, which had a reed valve block as part of the motor's fuel system, and these reed valve intake systems again kept the motor running very smoothly in all manner of racing conditions. And it was because it was fitted with this reed valve system that it almost eliminated that bogging down scenario that you used to experience with piston port two-strokers when diving into slow corners. And normally the stock carburetor on these 84 250s would have been a 36mm flat slide Mikuni carburetor, although in our case here it looks like Paul's substituted that for a flat slide key-in in its place. But as I remember, I think the earlier Suzuki RMs did have a kind of twin air filter setup in the past, although for 84 Suzuki then adopted this single filter and airbox on this model to make changing and servicing the filters much easier, which of course meant that everything could be accessed from the left hand side of the bike, which made the entire filter swapping process a lot simpler. And cutting holes in the air filter outer cover was again another common modifications that riders used to make on these Suzukis, just to try and get more of that air fuel mixture into the 250 water cooled motor. And once again, the 1984 250 Suzy had a 5-speed gearbox, so there was plenty cogs there available to keep your left foot busy when you were dancing up and down on that shifter, just to try and keep that motor on the pipe and in its preferred mid-range. But to make all of the sparks fly on our Suzuki, for the ignition system, it was a relatively modern style CDI electronic ignition system that was bolted into these very compact 250 motors. And on the transmission side, we also had a stock wet multi-plate clutch, which again was usually kept very busy shifting between the gears, because these clutches did take a bit of punishment as riders feathered and slipped them in the corners just to try and keep the motor in its sweet spot. Now, at the bike's front suspension department in 1984, it was a pair of 43mm Kayaba forks that would have been bolted onto our RM 250, and these would have given the rider, I think it was about 12 inches of travel here at the front end. Now, these Kayabas did have some scope for making small changes to the rebound and the damping, and overall these were still a pretty good setup on the 84 RM, but some riders did comment that these were maybe a bit too soft as a standard fitting. But once again, we still had an old school twin leading shoe type front brake here at the front, which was quite a good stopper considering that it was still an antiquated drum system. And on the back wheel, again, it was also a stock drum brake as well, but it wouldn't be too long before Suzuki then decided to make the move to more modern hydraulic disc brakes on all of their subsequent motocross models. Now, the rear suspension layout on the 84 RM was said to be about one of the best in the business for that year, and this full floater swing arm and single rear shock setup was quite good and gave the rider a decent amount of travel at this rear end. And of all of the other different configurations of rear suspensions that were fitted to some of Suzuki's competitors in that year, this full floater from Suzuki was without doubt one of the best. And basically this full floater system consisted of a single gas and oil filled rear shock with a remote reservoir, and this all connected to the swing arm by way of a linkage at the top and bottom, and then finally onto these two drop links that bolted on to either side of the alloy box section swing arm. But as I said, the rear suspension system on these RMs was certainly one of the big plus points on these 250 crossers, which is one of the reasons that made them so popular in 1984. And once more, as you'd expect, a plastic fuel tank on our Suzuki RM, which, as I remember, held around 2.5 gallons of pre-mix fuel, and also for that year Suzuki decided to fit the tank graphics onto the front radiator scoops instead of them directly onto the fuel tank as it had done in the past. And it was all done to stop riders from rubbing the graphics away with their knees when they were moving around on the bike, and also because it was just so difficult to keep graphics stuck to these plastic fuel cells, especially if you ended up spilling fuel over the top of them. The Suzuki's seat once again was well designed, with the front part of the seat creeping up the rear of that fuel tank. This design was of course to allow the rider to shift his weight as far to the front of the bike as possible, just to help it make tighter turns. And the seat also had these ribs on the top just to stop the rider's backside from sliding along the top. But up at the business end of our bike, Paul's fitted a pair of Acerbis handguards just to try and keep some of those big stones on the track from damaging his precious knuckles, although the rest of the handlebar controls are just basically your stock motocross race parts. And as far as I'm aware, all of the plastics on Paul's bike are pretty much the same stock items that were fitted to the bike in that year, but the levers, grips and throttle gasser have all been changed, as you'd expect on a 33-year-old motocrosser that's had many years of abuse and hard graft on the track. And again, the stock original RM250 exhaust that would have been fitted to this bike in '84 is now long gone, probably worn out with all of its years of being battered by stones and other debris on the racetrack. But it's been replaced by this very good quality pattern replacement from the guys at D&G Exhaust Systems, and Paul's also tried to protect his brand new pipe by bolting on this alloy exhaust pipe protector just to try and stop any further damage being inflicted on his new race pipe by those big Irish stones that are sometimes known to litter the track. But certainly Paul's 1984 RM250E is another very good example of one of these iconic Evolution motocrossers from that 1980s era. And even although this is maybe not a fully stock standard machine, it still has quite a lot of its original factory parts bolted onto it. Although if you were lucky enough to be able to buy one of these 250Es in that year, you didn't have to do much in the way of setting it up before you put it on the track, because straight out of the crate these Evo RMs were a decent racing package, because they did have quite a good handling chassis that despite it being made of tubular steel, it was still relatively light and easy enough to throw around. But the jewels in the crown of this featured bike was its superb reed valve two-stroke motor and that Suzuki full floater rear suspension system, which together made this RM250 one of the bikes to have in 1984. And over the course of that 2022 charity weekend, Paul certainly enjoyed himself on his 84 RM250, and I just happened to grab these couple of shots of Paul on the day while he was in full flight on his very quick RM Suzuki. But don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel if these are the kind of bikes that you like to look at here on YouTube, because we do have many more like these bikes to feature in the coming weeks and months. And next up, we'll be taking a look around this remanufactured 1974 CCM that was built by Joe Maxwell Engineering in Dumfries here in Scotland. So I do hope you'll all take the time to retune and come back to look at more of these old school vintage dirt bikes when we all return to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.